What if the earliest records of human civilization were never meant to describe a beginning, but a recovery? The first lines pressed into clay do not sound like dawn. They sound like aftermath. Lists without origins, kings without first fathers, cities already standing in memory before they are ever built in story. Something feels missing, as if history resumes mid-sentence. Tonight, we will move slowly through that absence. Not to declare what was lost, but to listen for the quiet shape it left behind. Stay with this silence. Let it unfold gently as we follow the traces that still refuse to explain themselves. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy stories that drift between dream and history. And if you're still awake, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. There is a quiet discomfort that settles in when the earlier Sumerian records are read slowly, without rushing toward interpretation. Clay tablets hardened by fire and time, incised with careful hands, do not behave like the expected opening chapter of human civilization. They do not begin with invention, discovery, or the first spark of order. Instead, they speak as if order already exists, as if memory is resuming rather than starting. Cities appear already named, institutions already function, rituals already obey rules whose origins are never explained. The sensation is subtle but persistent, like stepping into a conversation that began long before one arrived. The Sumerians left behind thousands of administrative tablets, hymns, king lists, legal codes, astronomical observations, and mythological compositions. Yet within this abundance, something essential is absent. There is no story of how writing was invented, no myth of the first city being founded from nothing, no clear account of how agriculture began or how social hierarchy first emerged. Instead, there are records of harvests managed by temples, measurements standardized across regions, and legal disputes resolved by systems that appear already mature. Civilization in these texts does not struggle into existence. It seems to awaken already organized. This absence has long been treated as an inconvenience rather than a question. Modern scholarship often assumes that the beginnings simply predate the surviving texts, lost to erosion or accident. And yet, even allowing for that loss, the tone of the surviving material remains strange. These are not documents written by people marveling at novelty. They read like records kept by caretakers of something inherited. The scribes do not explain why the world works as it does. They record that it does. The Sumerian king list deepens this unease. It famously opens with the statement that kingship descended from heaven. The first rulers are assigned reigns lasting tens of thousands of years. This is usually dismissed as mythic exaggeration, symbolic language, or theological metaphor. But even stripped of its literal implications, the structure of the list is revealing. It does not begin with chaos, tribes, or gradual leadership. It begins with kingship already established, already transferred, already recognized as an institution older than any named city. Authority, like civilization itself, arrives fully formed. After the flood, the king list continues with shorter reigns, more familiar durations, and cities that archaeology can partially confirm. This transition is often described as the shift from myth to history. But the text itself never frames it that way. It does not announce a new beginning. It suggests continuity interrupted, not creation achieved. The flood does not birth civilization, it reduces it. Even the myths that appear to describe origins feel curiously indirect. The Eridu-Genesis, often cited as a creation story, focuses not on humanity's first emergence, but on divine decisions regarding population control, labor distribution, and survival. Humans are already present. Cities already exist. The concern is not how life begins, but how it is managed, restrained, or reset. Creation, in these stories, feels administrative rather than miraculous. This pattern repeats in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The story opens with a king ruling a walled city, Uruk, whose construction is already legendary. Gilgamesh is not a founder, but an inheritor. The walls are ancient even to him. When the narrative looks backward, it does not describe humble beginnings, but a lost time when gods walked more closely with humans. When it looks forward, it does not promise progress, but warns of limits, mortality, and forgetting. The epic moves within a civilization already old enough to fear its own erasure. Archaeology complicates the picture further. Southern Mesopotamia shows evidence of sudden urbanization around the late 4th millennium BCE. Cities like Uruk expand rapidly, displaying advanced planning, monumental architecture, and bureaucratic complexity. This growth appears faster than many models of gradual development would predict. There are precursors, certainly, but the leap remains striking. The material record mirrors the textual unease. Civilization seems to accelerate rather than slowly accumulate. Some researchers have suggested that environmental pressure played a decisive role. The end of the last ice age brought dramatic changes to river systems, coastlines, and climate stability. The Persian Gulf, once a dry basin, flooded gradually as sea levels rose, potentially displacing earlier populations. Oral memory of such upheaval could echo faintly in flood myths and stories of lost homelands. In this view, Sumerian civilization may represent not a beginning but a regrouping after displacement. Others point to the possibility of older, submerged or eroded settlements now inaccessible. The absence of evidence becomes part of the silence. When early texts fail to describe origins, it may be because those origins were already distant, obscured by catastrophe or migration. Memory does not begin at zero. It resumes where survival allows. Yet there is another layer to consider. Sumerian texts demonstrate a remarkable confidence in inherited knowledge. Astronomical observations follow complex cycles. Mathematical systems operate in base 60 with precision. Legal codes assume long-standing norms. None of this is introduced as innovation. There is no narrative pride in having figured it out. The knowledge feels preserved rather than discovered. This preservation mindset extends to the role of the gods. The Anuna and later the Anunnaki are not creators in the abstract sense. They are administrators, assigners of roles, measurers of fate. They establish boundaries, enforce contracts, and regulate cosmic order. Their authority seems older than humanity's institutions, yet closely intertwined with them. Civilization appears as a joint project already underway, not a spark ignited from nothing. It is tempting to dismiss these impressions as modern projection, reading mystery into practical documents. But the consistency of the pattern remains. Across genres, from myth to accounting, the Sumerian record behaves like a middle chapter. It knows what has been lost but does not explain it. It functions as if explanation itself belongs to a deeper past. Even the language reflects this. Many Sumerian words for social roles, technologies, and rituals have no clear etymological roots within the language itself. They appear fully formed, resistant to internal decomposition. Linguists have noted this opacity, suggesting borrowing from earlier languages now extinct, or conceptual inheritance from cultures no longer visible. Language, like architecture, carries ghosts. What remains most striking is the emotional tone that seeps through the texts when they are read not as data, but as expression. There is reverence, anxiety, and restraint. The world is portrayed as ordered but fragile. Balance must be maintained. The gods can withdraw support. Cities can fall. Knowledge can vanish. Civilization is not celebrated as a triumph, but managed as a responsibility. This attitude does not align easily with the idea of a first civilization thrilled by its own emergence. It sounds more like a society aware of having arrived after something else, a society conscious of standing on ground that has already collapsed once before, and so the question lingers, unspoken but persistent in the negative space of the record. If the Sumerians did not see themselves at the beginning, where did they believe they stood? If they inherited systems they did not claim to invent, who or what came before? And why did the earliest writers choose silence over origin stories, leaving behind not a dawn but a horizon already fading from view? The tablets remain, heavy with ink and absence, waiting. What lingers after the first encounter with the Sumerian record is not a single missing fact, but a pattern of restraint. The texts do not behave as though their authors lacked curiosity about the past. On the contrary, Sumerian culture was deeply concerned with memory, continuity, and correct transmission. Lists were copied for centuries. Hymns preserved exact phrasing. Errors were marked and corrected. And yet, when it came to origins, the scribes drew a quiet boundary. They recorded what was given, not what was first. This restraint becomes clearer when examining the role of scribal education itself. The earliest schools, the Adaba, trained scribes through repetition of standard texts, lexical lists, and formulaic compositions. Students copied words for professions, objects, animals, metals, and places that already existed in the world they inhabited. The lists do not introduce these things as new. They assume familiarity. A civilization teaching itself did not begin by asking how it came to be. It began by learning how to maintain what was already there. Even more telling are the lexical lists that attempt to catalogue the universe. These texts sort reality into ordered categories, pairing Sumerian terms with Akkadian equivalents in later periods. They reflect a desire to stabilize meaning across time, as if language itself were at risk of erosion. Such an effort suggests a society conscious of loss. Cataloguing is rarely the act of a culture at its beginning. It is the instinct of one afraid of forgetting. The gods, too, are treated as ancient presences whose authority predates any human memory. Enlil does not rise to power. He holds it. Enki does not invent wisdom. He safeguards it. Inanna does not create the me. She acquires them. These divine decrees, the fundamental principles of civilization, are not forged in the narratives. They are transferred, stolen, negotiated, and guarded. Power circulates. It does not originate. The myth of Inanna's descent offers a revealing emotional texture. As she passes through the gates of the underworld, she is stripped of her symbols of authority one by one. What remains is not rebirth, but exposure. When she returns, order is restored, but nothing new is created. The myth revolves around loss, vulnerability, and recovery. It echoes a cultural memory in which survival matters more than invention. This focus on recovery rather than creation aligns uneasily with the archaeological record of the region. Southern Mesopotamia is a landscape shaped by instability. Rivers change course, floods destroy settlements, salinization ruins fields, entire cities are abandoned and later rebuilt nearby. Civilization here does not advance smoothly. It retreats and returns, often leaving little trace of what came before. In such an environment, continuity becomes an achievement, not an assumption. The absence of explicit beginnings may also reflect trauma. Cultures that experience profound disruption do not always narrate their origins. Instead, they ritualize stability. They repeat what works. They sanctify inherited forms. The Sumerians' devotion to precise ritual, exact calendrical cycles, and fixed temple layouts suggest a fear of deviation. Innovation exists, but it is quiet, incremental, rarely celebrated. One cannot ignore the symbolic weight of the flood narratives that appear across Mesopotamian literature. In the Atrahasis epic and later in Gilgamesh, the flood is not framed as the creation of a new world, but as a catastrophic correction. Humanity already exists. Cities already stand. The flood reduces noise, population, and disorder. Afterward, life resumes under stricter constraints. Mortality is enforced. Memory narrows. The world continues, diminished. These stories are often compared with later biblical traditions, but within their original context they feel less like moral tales and more like echoes. The flood is not explained in detail. Its mechanics are secondary. What matters is that it happened and that it changed something fundamental. The world after the flood is quieter, shorter-lived, more fragile. Civilization survives, but with a sense of having crossed a threshold it cannot recross. The king list reinforces this impression by marking a sharp reduction in reign lengths after the flood. Whether symbolic or not, the narrative logic is clear. Time itself contracts. Human authority becomes temporary. The list does not celebrate this change. It simply records it. Acceptance replaces triumph. There is also the matter of geographical memory. Early Sumerian texts refer to lands that are difficult to identify archaeologically. Some are distant, mountainous, or mythic. Others may correspond to regions now underwater or transformed beyond recognition. The idea of Dilmun, for instance, appears as a place of purity and origin, yet it is never clearly located. It exists as a remembered elsewhere, a point of reference rather than a destination. This remembered elsewhere functions less as paradise and more as absence. It is where sickness does not exist, where death is unknown. But it is not where the Sumerians live. They stand outside it, aware of the distance. Civilization in this light is not the pinnacle of human experience, but a compromise with loss. Modern narratives often frame civilization as a triumph over nature, ignorance, or chaos. The Sumerian record resists this framing. Nature remains powerful and unpredictable. The gods remain inscrutable. Knowledge must be appeased and preserved, not conquered. Progress is not assumed. Decline is always possible. Even technological achievements are described without fanfare. Writing appears not as a marvel, but as a tool. Metallurgy is listed, not praised. Architecture is measured, not mythologized. When pride appears, it is often defensive, embedded in prayers asking the gods to remember the city, protect its walls, and keep its name alive. The fear is not that civilization will fail to begin, but that it will end again. The cumulative effect of these patterns is a quiet suggestion. The Sumerians did not see themselves at the dawn of history. They saw themselves somewhere after it. They inherited fragments, systems, and responsibilities whose origins were already obscured. Their task was not to explain the beginning, but to prevent another disappearance. This does not require invoking lost super-civilizations or forgotten golden ages. It requires only attention to tone. A civilization at its beginning speaks differently from one conscious of fragility. The Sumerian voice is careful, reverent, and restrained. It does not shout its achievements. It records them, as if recording itself were an act of survival. What remains unresolved is why this awareness never crystallized into explicit origin narratives. Perhaps the loss was too deep. Perhaps the memory belonged to a time before language as they knew it. Or perhaps silence itself was part of the inheritance, a boundary not to be crossed. The tablets do not answer. They persist, repeating systems, preserving order, and carrying forward a civilization that seems less concerned with where it began than with whether it will be remembered at all. As the silence around beginnings deepens, another tension emerges from the Sumerian material, one that feels less like absence and more like displacement. The civilization speaks constantly of order, yet rarely of choice. Humans appear not as self-directed pioneers, but as participants in a system whose logic precedes them. Labor is assigned, ritual is prescribed, fate is measured. Even kingship feels conditional, granted and withdrawn according to forces that do not explain themselves. Civilization unfolds as obligation rather than aspiration. This sense of obligation is embedded in the very myths that later cultures would read as creation stories. In the Atrahasis epic, humans are fashioned not out of wonder but necessity. The gods are overburdened. Work must be done. Humanity is introduced as a solution to labor imbalance. The narrative is not celebratory. It is transactional. Existence itself carries a debt. From the moment humans appear, they are already embedded in a hierarchy older than themselves. The tone of this myth matters. It does not frame humanity as the culmination of cosmic intention. It frames humanity as an adjustment. Civilization, in turn, becomes a system for managing this adjustment, organizing labor, appeasing divine forces, maintaining balance. There is no language of liberation here, only structure. What is striking is how naturally this worldview is accepted across texts. There is little protest against assigned roles. Even rebellion, when it appears, is ritualized and contained. When noise becomes too great, when population overwhelms the system, correction arrives in the form of plague, famine, or flood. These are not framed as punishments in the moral sense. They are resets. Civilization exceeds its parameters, and the parameters reassert themselves. Such a worldview suggests inherited limits. The rules are not being discovered, they are being enforced. Knowledge is something to be preserved accurately, not expanded recklessly. The scribal tradition reflects this discipline. Texts are copied word for word. Deviations are marked. Authority lies in fidelity to precedent. This fidelity extends to cosmology. The Sumerian universe is layered and ordered. Heaven, earth, and the underworld are not mysteries to be explored, but realms with fixed functions. The paths of stars are observed, not to unlock their secrets, but to maintain calendrical precision. Time itself becomes cyclical, governed by repetition rather than progress. Cyclical time has consequences for how beginnings are perceived. In a world where patterns repeat, origins lose narrative importance. What matters is alignment. Ritual reenacts cosmic order. Festivals restore balance. The past is not something to overcome, but something to synchronize with. In such a framework, the idea of a singular beginning may feel irrelevant or even dangerous. This may explain why Sumerian texts devote so much attention to proper performance and so little to innovation. The world is stable only when it mirrors an older template. Deviations invite disorder. The role of the king is not to invent new systems, but to uphold ancient ones. Even conquest is justified not by expansion, but by restoration of rightful order. Archaeological evidence reinforces this conservatism. Early city layouts follow repeated patterns. Temple architecture adheres to established forms across centuries. Changes occur, but they are gradual, almost reluctant. When innovation does appear, it is often framed as recovery of something forgotten rather than invention of something new. This posture becomes more intelligible when viewed against the backdrop of environmental precarity. Mesopotamia's landscape is unforgiving. A single flood can erase generations of construction. Salinization can collapse an economy silently. In such conditions, experimentation carries risk. Stability becomes sacred. Yet this explanation alone does not account for the persistent sense that something older underlies the system itself. The laws, the measurements, the divisions of labour feel too internally consistent, too widely shared, to have emerged spontaneously within a short time frame. They feel codified, transmitted, normalised before the earlier surviving texts were written. This raises the possibility that what we see in Sumer is not the invention of civilization, but its formalisation, a process of taking inherited practices and locking them into durable form. Writing, in this view, does not create civilization, it freezes it. It preserves a snapshot of a system already long in use. If so, then the absence of beginnings is not accidental. Writing appears after the need to remember becomes urgent. It emerges when oral continuity is no longer sufficient. The first texts are administrative not because imagination was limited, but because preservation was the priority. Memory was under threat. This threat may have been cultural rather than environmental. Linguistic evidence suggests that Sumerian was not related to surrounding languages. It appears isolated, with no clear ancestors. This isolation implies either migration or survival of a linguistic remnant after surrounding cultures vanished or transformed. In either case, language itself becomes a vessel of memory, carrying concepts older than their current context. Loanwords in later Akkadian texts preserve Sumerian terms for institutions, rituals and technologies long after Sumerian ceased to be spoken. This persistence suggests that the conceptual framework of civilization outlived its original language community. Structures remained even as voices changed. Such endurance points again to inheritance rather than invention. Civilizations that invent tend to celebrate. Civilizations that inherit tend to conserve. The Sumerians conserved obsessively. They wrote as if aware that forgetting was the true enemy. The emotional texture of their prayers supports this reading. Supplications ask the gods to remember the city, remember the king, remember the people. Forgetting is portrayed as catastrophe. To be erased from divine attention is to cease to exist. Memory is not nostalgia. It is survival. This fear of erasure extends to names. Names are repeated, inscribed, invoked. The anxiety that a name might vanish suggests a past where names already had. The flood narratives reinforce this. Cities destroyed, generations lost, knowledge narrowed. Civilization survives, but thinner. What remains unclear is whether this thinning was gradual or sudden. The texts do not say. They only imply that what exists now is less than what once was. Longevity has shortened. Direct contact with the divine has receded. Knowledge is mediated through ritual rather than experience. This sense of diminishment permeates the culture. It does not produce despair, but caution. Civilization is something to be maintained carefully, like a fragile inheritance passed down without instructions. The Sumerians do not claim to understand its origin, because understanding may no longer be possible. In this light, the missing beginning becomes meaningful. It is not ignorance, it is acknowledgement of a boundary. The past beyond that boundary cannot be recovered, only honoured indirectly through preservation of form. The record, then, does not begin with confidence, it begins with responsibility. A civilization aware that it did not start the story, but has been entrusted with its continuation. As the sense of inheritance settles more firmly into view, another layer begins to surface, quieter but no less unsettling. It is the way Sumerian civilization treats knowledge itself, not as something to be expanded endlessly, but as something already measured, already bounded. Wisdom does not appear as an open horizon. It appears as a finite substance, portioned, guarded, and distributed with care. To know too much, or too soon, is not portrayed as progress. It is portrayed as imbalance. This attitude is woven into the concept of the me, the divine decrees that structure reality. These are not abstract virtues or moral principles. They are concrete functions: kingship, craftsmanship, truth, deception, mourning, music, judgment. Civilization in this framework is not built from ideas, but assembled from permissions. Each me exists independently of human desire. They are held, transferred, stolen, and restored, but never created. Their origin lies beyond narrative reach. When Inanna acquires the me from Enki, the episode is not celebrated as innovation. It is tense, ambiguous, and destabilizing. The city gains power, but the transfer requires correction. The me must be returned to proper order. The story is not about expansion of civilization, but redistribution of a fixed cosmic inventory. There is a limit to how much can be held, and where. This conception leaves little room for a heroic origin story. Civilization is not a flame lit by human ingenuity. It is a structure assembled from pre-existing components, granted temporarily, subject to revocation. The role of humanity is custodial. The role of the gods is regulatory. Such a worldview reshapes how beginnings would be remembered. If civilization is composed of eternal elements rearranged over time, then the moment of assembly matters less than the integrity of the arrangement. Beginnings dissolve into cycles of loss and restoration. The question of how it started becomes secondary to whether it is still aligned. This alignment is fragile. Sumerian literature repeatedly emphasizes the ease with which order can slip. A king fails in ritual duty, and famine follows. A city neglects its temple, and protection withdraws. The gods do not argue. They depart. Collapse is quiet, procedural, and devastating. The archaeological record echoes this fragility. Entire urban centres vanish from one layer to the next, not burned, not conquered, simply abandoned. Walls remain, foundations persist, but life relocates, as if something essential had shifted. These moments leave few dramatic traces, but their cumulative effect is profound. Civilization flickers, relocates, reforms. In this context, the absence of a beginning feels less like a gap, and more like a survival strategy. To emphasize origins would be to emphasize vulnerability. Better to anchor identity in maintenance, not emergence. Better to look sideways at continuity than backward at loss. The Sumerian obsession with proper measure reflects this mentality. Weights, lengths, volumes, time cycles, all are standardized early and maintained with extraordinary consistency. Measurement is not merely practical, it is moral. To measure correctly is to participate in order. To mismeasure is to invite chaos. Even justice follows this logic. Legal codes do not invent fairness, they enforce balance. Punishments are proportional, scaled, calculated. The goal is not reform but restoration of equilibrium. Justice repairs deviation. It does not redefine norms. This devotion to equilibrium suggests a civilization deeply aware of thresholds. There is a sense that certain lines once crossed cannot be uncrossed. Excess noise, excess population, excess disorder provoke correction. The flood myths express this most starkly, but the principle permeates everyday administration. When humanity grows too numerous, it is reduced. When memory grows too long, it is narrowed. Long reigns give way to short ones. Lifespans contract. Civilization continues, but under constraint. The world becomes quieter, smaller, more manageable. These constraints are never framed as failures. They are presented as necessities. The universe is not infinite. It is calibrated. Civilization exists within margins it did not define. This worldview makes the idea of a first civilization almost irrelevant. What matters is not who came first, but who remains within balance. A civilization that understands itself as second, or third, or diminished will focus on preservation rather than celebration. It will speak carefully. It will record faithfully. It will avoid grand claims. The Sumerians' reluctance to describe beginnings may thus reflect humility born of experience. If earlier orders rose and fell, then certainty becomes dangerous. Silence becomes wisdom. Later cultures that inherited Mesopotamian traditions often reinterpreted these silences as mysteries to be solved. But within the original context, they may not have been mysteries at all. They may have been acknowledgements of limit. There are things not meant to be fully known, because knowing them does not restore what was lost. This attitude contrasts sharply with modern historical imagination, which seeks linear narratives, clear origins, and progressive arcs. The Sumerian record resists this structure. It offers continuity without genesis, order without foundation, memory without explanation. The more one reads, the clearer it becomes that this is not an oversight. It is a posture. Civilization is treated as a condition one wakes into, not a project one begins. Its legitimacy comes from alignment with inherited order, not from novelty. This posture carries an undercurrent of mourning, not explicit grief, but a steady awareness that something has receded. The gods are less present. Lifespans are shorter. Knowledge is mediated through texts rather than direct experience. Writing itself may be a symptom of this distance, a tool necessitated by a loss of immediacy. If so, then the first written records do not celebrate arrival. They mark separation. They preserve what can no longer be held directly. The clay tablet becomes a substitute for memory that once lived elsewhere. This interpretation casts the absence of beginnings in a different light. The beginning may not be missing. It may be inaccessible, not forgotten, but unreachable, belonging to a mode of existence no longer available. The Sumerians do not attempt to bridge this gap with speculation. They do not reconstruct what came before. They accept the distance and build within it. Civilization becomes an act of endurance rather than discovery. What survives is not a story of origins, but a discipline of continuation, the quiet insistence that order, however diminished, is still worth preserving. That memory, even partial, still matters. And so the record begins where it must, not at the dawn of civilization, but at the moment when civilization realized it could be lost and chose to speak carefully into the silence left behind. As continuity replaces origin as the central concern, attention drifts toward the figures who stand closest to the boundary between loss and preservation. Kings, priests, and scribes do not present themselves as innovators. They appear as intermediaries, positioned between an older order and a fragile present. Authority flows through them, but does not originate from them. Their legitimacy depends on alignment, accuracy, and restraint. Kingship, in particular, carries a weight that feels inherited rather than achieved. Royal inscriptions emphasize piety, restoration, and obedience to divine instruction. Victories are framed as fulfillment of mandate, not personal ambition. When rulers rebuild temples, they often claim to follow ancient plans revealed in dreams or recovered from buried foundations. The act of construction becomes an act of remembrance. This pattern is visible in the repeated motif of foundation deposits. Beneath temples and city walls, objects are buried, inscriptions, figurines, ritual items, meant to anchor the structure to cosmic order. These deposits often invoke earlier kings, earlier cities, earlier acts of alignment. The present is secured by embedding it physically into memory. Architecture itself becomes an archive. Such practices suggest a culture anxious about drift. Without constant reinforcement, order might slide away. The king's role is not to chart new paths, but to keep the city tethered to an invisible framework inherited from the past. Innovation, when it occurs, is justified as restoration of a truer form. The scribes mirror this posture with even greater intensity. Their labor is meticulous, repetitive, and conservative. Errors are not simply mistakes, they are deviations from order. Texts are copied even when their language is no longer spoken, preserving form over comprehension. Meaning becomes secondary to fidelity. This fidelity points again to loss. When understanding weakens, form becomes sacred. The sign is preserved even if its origin is obscured. Writing becomes a vessel carrying something fragile across time. The fact that Sumerian continued as a scholarly language long after it ceased to be spoken underscores this function. It was no longer a living tongue, but it remained authoritative. Religious ritual reinforces this dynamic. Hymns and incantations repeat archaic phrases whose meanings were likely already unclear to later practitioners, yet pronunciation and sequence mattered deeply. Power resided not in interpretation, but in exact performance. Ritual language functioned less as communication and more as alignment. This emphasis on correctness suggests a belief that the world responds to precision. The right word, spoken in the right order, at the right time, maintains balance. Error risks collapse. In such a worldview, experimentation carries danger. Origins once disrupted may not be recoverable. The gods themselves are portrayed as guardians of this order rather than authors of novelty. Enlil enforces boundaries. Enki manages knowledge carefully, often withholding as much as he reveals. Even Inanna's disruptive energy ultimately returns to equilibrium. The divine realm values regulation over creation. Human beings within this structure are custodians of routines that predate them. Their success lies in accurate repetition. Their failure lies in excess or neglect. The world does not invite reinvention. It demands maintenance. This maintenance-oriented worldview shapes how catastrophe is understood. When cities fall, explanations rarely focus on external enemies alone. The emphasis rests on imbalance, neglect, or withdrawal of divine favor. Collapse is internal before it is external. The loss of alignment precedes physical destruction. Archaeological layers show this pattern starkly. Periods of prosperity are followed by sudden abandonment, often without evidence of violent conquest. Environmental stress, administrative breakdown, or ritual neglect may have undermined stability long before walls were breached. Civilization does not end with spectacle, it dissolves. Such dissolution leaves behind ruins that later generations encounter as inherited landscapes. Reoccupation often occurs nearby, not directly atop the ruins, as if the ground itself carries memory. The new city aligns itself with the old, but does not claim to replace it fully. Continuity is honoured without erasing loss. This layered habitation creates a palimpsest effect. Civilization builds upon traces of itself, each layer aware, at least dimly, of what lies beneath. The absence of origin stories may reflect this physical reality. There is no single foundation. There are many, buried under one another. The cumulative effect is a culture that sees itself as a steward rather than a pioneer. Stewardship implies accountability to a past that cannot be fully accessed. Decisions are weighed against precedent. Authority is borrowed. Knowledge is guarded. Even myths of heroic defiance ultimately reinforce this ethic. Gilgamesh seeks immortality, but returns empty-handed. His journey does not rewrite human limits, it clarifies them. The lesson is not aspiration, but acceptance. The walls of Uruk, already ancient, become the true legacy. In this sense, civilization's value lies not in transcendence, but in durability. To last is the highest achievement. To be remembered is a form of survival. Writing, architecture, ritual, all converge on this goal. The refusal to narrate a true beginning may thus reflect an understanding that beginnings are fragile and endings are inevitable. What matters is the interval in between and how carefully it is tended. Civilization becomes a holding pattern between loss and forgetting. This perspective does not produce despair, it produces vigilance. Every act of record-keeping, every ritual repetition, every restoration of a crumbling wall becomes meaningful. The future depends on accuracy. Seen this way, the Sumerian record does not fail to describe a beginning. It deliberately situates itself elsewhere. It speaks from within a long middle, conscious of what preceded but unable to recover it fully, aware of what may follow but unwilling to predict it. The tone that emerges is neither naive nor triumphant. It is cautious, reverent, and persistent. Civilization is treated not as a destiny, but as a condition that must be continually earned through restraint. What lingers most strongly is the sense that the Sumerians lived with an inherited gravity. They stood on ground shaped by events they did not witness, governed by rules they did not author. Their response was not to speculate wildly, but to preserve quietly. The absence of a beginning, then, becomes part of the message. Civilization does not announce itself. It survives by remembering what it can, repeating what works, and accepting the limits of what can be known. The record remains, not as a declaration of origin, but as an act of careful holding, extended across centuries against the slow pull of erasure. As the structure of preservation grows clearer, attention turns toward the way Sumerian civilization treats time itself. Time is not experienced as a forward march toward novelty, but as a measured field through which order must be continuously recalibrated. Days, months, years, and reigns are counted with precision, yet the act of counting does not suggest optimism. It suggests vigilance. Time is something that can slip out of alignment if not watched carefully. Calendrical systems appear remarkably early in Mesopotamia, already complex, already standardized. Festivals recur according to fixed cycles. Agricultural tasks align with celestial movements. The heavens are observed not as mysteries to decode, but as regulators to consult. The sky does not inspire speculation so much as compliance. Stars mark time. They do not invite transcendence. This relationship with time reinforces the absence of a beginning. In a cyclical system, origins dissolve into recurrence. What matters is not when something first happened, but whether it continues to happen correctly. The new year does not celebrate a first moment. It restores balance. Ritual reenacts order so that time does not drift too far from its template. Even historical time is handled cautiously. Year names commemorate specific events, but these events are administrative, religious, or corrective. They mark restorations, offerings, constructions, and judgments. Rarely do they commemorate innovation for its own sake. Time is catalogued through acts of maintenance. The king list, when viewed through this lens, becomes less a historical document and more a temporal scaffold. It orders time by reign, not by era. Kings follow one another in a chain that emphasizes continuity over transformation. The dramatic compression of reign lengths after the flood does not signal progress. It signals constraint. Time itself has been tightened. Longevity, in Sumerian literature, is not something humanity gains. It is something humanity loses. Early figures live extraordinarily long lives. Later ones do not. This pattern is not explained. It is accepted. The direction of time is downward, not upward. Civilization moves away from fullness toward limitation. This orientation colors the emotional texture of the myths. The past is heavier, closer to the gods, more potent. The present is narrower, more regulated. The future is uncertain, dependent on continued alignment. Time does not promise improvement. It threatens erosion. Writing emerges within this context as a technology of resistance. It slows decay. It fixes memory in material form. Clay tablets do not stop time, but they anchor it. They allow repetition across generations. What cannot be preserved in experience is preserved in sign. This function of writing explains its early administrative focus. Accounting is memory made external. It replaces trust in continuity with documentation. When societies feel stable, they rely on shared presence. When stability weakens, records multiply. The Sumerian explosion of documentation suggests a society already anxious about loss. Knowledge is no longer safe in the body alone. It must be stored, indexed, copied. The archive becomes a defense against disappearance. This defensive posture extends to law. Legal codes codify expectations so that memory cannot distort them. Justice becomes less a matter of negotiation and more a matter of reference. The law remembers so that people do not have to. But codification carries a cost. Flexibility diminishes. Adaptation slows. Civilization becomes heavy with its own preservation mechanisms. The weight of inherited structure increases with each generation. This weight may explain the subdued tone of Sumerian texts. There is little exuberance. Even praise is measured. Joy appears, but it is ritualized. Emotion is contained within form. Excess threatens balance. The gods themselves reflect this containment. They are powerful but constrained by roles. Each governs a domain. Authority is distributed. Conflict occurs, but it resolves into structure. The universe is not chaotic. It is bureaucratic. Within such a universe, beginnings lose narrative appeal. The bureaucracy is already in place, forms already exist. The question of who filed the first record becomes irrelevant. What matters is whether the records continue to be filed correctly. Civilization then is not a story of ascent, it is a process of holding. Each generation receives a burden and passes it on. The burden includes knowledge, ritual, measurement, and memory. It also includes silence, where memory no longer reaches. This silence is not empty. It exerts pressure. It shapes behavior. The awareness that something fundamental lies beyond reach produces caution. One does not invent freely when one suspects that the past contained answers no longer accessible. The reluctance to describe beginnings may thus reflect respect rather than ignorance. To speak inaccurately about origins would risk misalignment. Better to remain silent than to distort what cannot be verified. This respect for limit is philosophical as much as practical. Sumerian wisdom literature emphasizes humility before forces larger than human understanding. Fate is measured, not mastered. Knowledge has edges. In later traditions, this humility often erodes. Successor cultures reinterpret Sumerian material through more linear frameworks. Origins are reconstructed. Creation becomes explicit. Confidence grows, but the earliest layer retains its restraint. The absence of a true beginning in the Sumerian record is therefore consistent with its entire worldview. A civilization oriented toward maintenance, balance, and continuity has little use for origin myths that imply rupture or novelty. What it offers instead is a sustained meditation on survival within constraint. Civilization is presented as something already old, already worn, already precious. Its task is not to explain itself, but to endure. Time passes, cities rise and fall, languages change, but the structure persists, carried forward by those willing to repeat, record, and remember. The beginning, whatever it was, recedes further into silence. The record does not chase it. It anchors itself where footing remains solid. In doing so, it reveals a civilization more concerned with staying within the world than explaining how the world began. What survives is a voice speaking from the middle of things, aware of depth beneath it, cautious about the edges, and committed to holding what remains steady as time continues its quiet, narrowing flow. As attention moves deeper into the texture of Sumerian civilization, a subtler tension becomes visible, one that does not appear in monuments or myths directly, but in the way authority is remembered. Power is always described as descending, never emerging. It comes from above, from elsewhere, from a realm already ordered. Kings do not claim authorship over civilization, they claim receipt. This posture shapes the entire political imagination. Kingship is never portrayed as an experiment. It is a condition restored when lost, transferred when disrupted, withdrawn when misaligned. The earliest rulers in the king list do not found cities, they reign over them. Their legitimacy is not negotiated among people, it is confirmed cosmically. Even when dynasties change, the language remains the same. Authority does not evolve, it relocates. Such a framework leaves little room for a narrative of first governance. If power descends fully formed, then its initial arrival lies outside human memory. The moment when kingship first entered the world is not accessible to those who merely hold it. That moment belongs to a different order of time. This may explain why Sumerian political texts focus so heavily on confirmation rituals. Enthronement ceremonies, divine endorsements, and temple restorations serve to re-anchor authority. The king must continually prove alignment with a standard he did not set. Rule is conditional, fragile, and revocable. Rebellion, in this context, is not revolutionary. It is aberrant. When uprisings occur, they are framed as disorder rather than alternative vision. The resolution is restoration of proper alignment, not restructuring of power. Political imagination remains conservative because its foundation is inherited, not constructed. This conservatism extends into social hierarchy. Occupational roles appear fixed early on. Priests, scribes, labourers, artisans, and officials populate the record with defined functions. Mobility exists, but within narrow bounds. The system does not invite reconfiguration. It demands participation. Such rigidity suggests a civilization that perceives itself as operating within a pre-established blueprint. Deviations are tolerated only when justified as recoveries of a more authentic form. Change must disguise itself as return. The emotional undertone of this arrangement is complex. On one hand, it produces stability. On the other, it fosters anxiety. If order depends on perfect alignment with an inherited template, then error becomes existential. A misstep does not merely fail, it endangers the world. This anxiety surfaces in the constant appeal to divine oversight. Gods are invoked to witness treaties, validate decisions, and punish deviation. Their presence reinforces the sense that civilization is monitored from beyond itself, autonomy is limited, responsibility is immense. Yet the gods themselves are not omnipotent in the abstract sense. They too operate within constraints. They quarrel, negotiate, redistribute authority. The cosmos is hierarchical but not absolute. Order is maintained through balance, not domination. Within such a cosmos, the idea of a singular beginning would be disruptive. A beginning implies a moment of freedom, of unstructured potential. The Sumerian worldview offers little room for such a moment. Structure appears primordial, freedom appears dangerous. This may be why creative acts are framed cautiously. When innovation occurs, it is attributed to divine instruction, rather than human insight. Dreams, omens, and revelations authorize change. The individual does not invent, the individual receives. Even craftsmanship follows this logic. Artisans reproduce canonical forms. Variation is subtle. Style persists across generations. The goal is not expression, but correctness. Objects must fit their function within the cosmic order. This attitude toward creation reflects again a civilization that does not see itself at the start of things. Beginnings imply authorship. Authorship implies responsibility for structure. The Sumerians consistently deflect such responsibility upward and backward. Language reinforces this deflection. Many Sumerian texts avoid explicit causal explanation. Events occur because they are decreed. Outcomes follow alignment or misalignment. The chain of causation disappears into authority. This does not indicate intellectual weakness. It indicates philosophical restraint. To trace causation too far might expose gaps in understanding that threaten coherence. Better to stop at the boundary of decree. Over time, this restraint hardens into tradition. Silence around origins becomes customary. What is not said gains weight through repetition. The absence itself becomes part of the inherited structure. Archaeology, once again, echoes this pattern. Layers accumulate without clear transitions. Cultural phases blur into one another. The material record resists neat beginnings. It suggests continuity punctuated by disruption, not clean emergence. Even when new technologies appear, they integrate seamlessly into existing systems. Writing supports administration already in place. Metallurgy enhances tools already used. The narrative is one of refinement, not invention. This refinement-oriented trajectory reinforces the sense that civilization is always already underway. Each generation improves upon what it inherits, but never claims to originate it. Progress is incremental and cautious. The question of who first organized society, measured time, or built cities thus remains unaddressed not because it was unknown, but because it was irrelevant to the present task. The task was to keep the system functioning. This functional orientation shapes memory itself. What is remembered are procedures, rituals, lists, names. What is forgotten are moments of emergence that no longer serve operational needs. Memory becomes selective, pragmatic. Over centuries, this selectivity solidifies into worldview. Civilization is no longer imagined as something that began. It is something that exists precariously, requiring constant reinforcement. Later cultures, encountering the Sumerian record, often attempt to extract origins from it. They search for first kings, first cities, first laws. But the record resists this extraction. It does not yield a starting point because it was never designed to provide one. The Sumerians were not writing for future historians, they were writing for continuity. Their audience was the next generation tasked with maintaining balance, not outsiders seeking explanation. This internal orientation explains much of the quiet confidence in the texts. There is no need to persuade, there is no need to justify. The world is assumed. The task is to keep it aligned. The absence of a beginning thus becomes an expression of maturity rather than a mission. Civilization has aged enough to know that origins do not guarantee survival. Only discipline does. What remains is a record that feels settled, weighted, and inward-facing. It does not look outward toward creation. It looks inward toward preservation. In this inward gaze, civilization becomes less a story and more a condition. It is something one inhabits carefully, aware that it did not arise from one's own effort, and may not endure without constant attention. The beginning, whatever it was, fades into irrelevance. What matters is the present alignment and the fragile continuity stretching forward, carrying inherited structures across time, one careful repetition at a time. As the long chain of continuity stretches further, another quiet feature of the Sumerian record begins to stand out. The way memory itself is treated as something unstable, something that must be continually anchored to material form. Memory is not trusted to endure on its own. It requires reinforcement through objects, spaces, and repeated actions. Civilization does not merely remember, it externalizes remembrance. This externalization is visible everywhere. Temples are rebuilt on the same sacred footprints, even when cities shift or populations decline. Ritual objects are deposited beneath floors and walls, sealed into the earth as if memory itself must be buried to survive. The act of building becomes an act of binding the present to an inherited past that cannot speak directly. The city, in this sense, functions as a mnemonic device. Streets follow familiar orientations, temples face established directions, sacred precincts repeat layouts whose origins are no longer explained. Movement through space reenacts memory unconsciously. One does not need to know the origin of a ritual to participate in its repetition. This reliance on spatial memory suggests a civilization that does not fully trust narrative memory. Stories can change, oral transmission can drift, but stone foundations endure longer. Clay tablets last longer than voices. Civilization leans toward durability over explanation. Writing plays a central role in this shift. Early inscriptions are not reflective. They do not ponder. They label, measure, assign. Writing fixes relationships. This field belongs to this temple. This offering was made to this god. This amount was delivered on this date. These are acts of anchoring, not storytelling. Over time, narrative texts emerge, but even they retain an archival tone. Myths are structured, formulaic, restrained. They are not improvisational performances. They are records meant to be preserved accurately. Variation is limited, stability is prized. This preference for stable transmission over creative expansion hints again at a civilization aware of fragility. When memory is threatened, accuracy becomes sacred. One copies rather than invents. One preserves rather than embellishes. The fear underlying this behavior is not abstract. It is reflected in the repeated experience of loss. Floods erase settlements, droughts collapse economies, political centers shift, languages fade, civilization survives but not intact. Each survival carries scars. These scars do not produce nostalgia in the modern sense. They produce caution. The past is not romanticized. It is respected as something heavier, closer to order, closer to the gods. The present is thinner, more constrained. This thinning appears explicitly in Sumerian reflections on human condition. Humans are mortal. They labor. They suffer illness. Their lives are brief compared to divine time. These facts are not framed as punishments. They are conditions. What is striking is the lack of protest. There is no narrative of rebellion against mortality. Even Gilgamesh's quest ends in acceptance. The lesson is not triumph over limits, but recognition of them. Civilization operates within boundaries it did not set. Such recognition influences how knowledge is treated. Wisdom is not pursued endlessly. It is curated. Certain knowledge is restricted to priests or specialists. Secrets are guarded. Revelation is controlled. This control suggests an awareness that knowledge can destabilize as easily as it can empower. Too much knowledge, or knowledge held improperly, risks imbalance. Silence becomes a tool of preservation. This perspective casts the absence of origin narratives in a new light. To explain beginnings would be to open a domain of speculation with unpredictable consequences. It might invite reinterpretation, debate, or misuse. Silence maintains stability. In this context, myth serves not to explain origins, but to model relationships. Humans relate to gods, cities relate to temples, kings relate to divine order. The focus remains relational rather than historical. What matters is how things connect, not how they began. Even when earlier times are referenced, they are described vaguely. A time when gods walked more closely with humans, a time of longer lives, a time before reduction. These are not dates, they are conditions. They mark difference without detail. The lack of detail is significant. It suggests that whatever preceded the current order is not fully compatible with it. The world before was different in kind, not merely earlier in time. Its rules no longer apply. This incompatibility may explain why Sumerian texts avoid reconstructing the past. To do so would be to import foreign logic into a fragile present. Better to acknowledge difference without attempting integration. The memory of reduction, shortened lifespans, diminished access to the divine, increased labour pervades the worldview. Civilization is not the peak of human experience. It is a negotiated settlement after loss. Within such a settlement, caution governs expression. Even praise is measured. Hymns exalt gods but often emphasize fear and obligation alongside devotion. Joy is present, but it is bounded. The emotional palette of the civilization reflects this balance. There is beauty, but it is formal. There is music, but it follows established modes. There is art, but it adheres to canonical forms. Excess is avoided. This avoidance reinforces the sense that civilization exists within tight margins. There is little room for experimentation at the foundational level. Change must occur slowly, framed as restoration rather than rupture. The refusal to describe a true beginning thus aligns with a broader refusal to imagine radical transformation. Civilization does not see itself as moving towards something fundamentally new. It moves to sustain what remains. This orientation produces a distinctive kind of historical consciousness. The past is not a linear sequence of improvements. It is a reservoir of patterns to be maintained. The future is not promised. It must be earned continuously. Such a consciousness is difficult to reconcile with modern expectations of origin stories. Modern narratives seek causality, progression, and emergence. The Sumerian record offers continuity, constraint, and endurance. The more deeply one reads, the clearer it becomes that the silence around beginnings is active rather than accidental. It performs a function. It stabilizes identity. It protects order from speculative erosion. The beginning, if it existed as a distinct moment, belongs to a realm no longer accessible through current forms of knowledge. Attempting to narrate it would exceed the system's capacity. Silence becomes fidelity. This fidelity extends across generations. Each scribe copies what was given, each king restores what was inherited, each ritual reenacts alignment. Civilization persists not by remembering everything, but by remembering carefully. The absence of a beginning thus becomes an anchor rather than a void. It marks the boundary of what can be safely carried forward. Beyond it lies a different order, acknowledged but not entered. The record stands, heavy with repetition and restraint, speaking not of how civilization began, but of how it continues despite knowing that something essential has already slipped beyond reach. As preservation becomes habit rather than choice, the Sumerian worldview reveals an even deeper tension. The uneasy relationship between survival and truth. What is preserved is not necessarily what is complete. What endures is what remains useful within constraint. Civilization in this sense is selective memory hardened into structure. The earliest texts do not pretend to tell everything. They do not aim at fullness, they aim at function. A list that names professions does not explain why those professions exist. A hymn that praises a god does not recount how that god came to rule. A legal code regulates behavior without narrating its origin. Each text performs its task and stops. This restraint is not accidental. It reflects an understanding that truth, when exposed without structure, can destabilize. Knowledge is not neutral. It reshapes relationships, redistributes power, and alters balance. The Sumerians appear keenly aware of this risk. Priestly authority depends on controlled transmission. Scribal authority depends on fidelity. Royal authority depends on alignment. In each case, the stability of the system relies on limiting interpretive freedom. Meaning is not endlessly debated, it is maintained. This does not eliminate doubt. Instead, doubt is displaced inward. The record carries an undercurrent of uncertainty, but it is never resolved publicly. Anxiety exists, but it is ritualized rather than theorized. Questions are absorbed into practice, not articulated as critique. The myths reflect this displacement. When disorder arises, it is not discussed philosophically. It is corrected procedurally. A god withdraws favor. A ritual is neglected. A boundary is crossed. The response is adjustment, not inquiry. Such a framework leaves little space for origin narratives, which by nature invite inquiry. To ask how civilization began is to ask whether it could have begun differently. That question threatens alignment. Silence protects continuity. This protective silence becomes clearer when examining moments where the record comes closest to reflection. Wisdom texts, lamentations, and prayers occasionally hint at doubt. Cities are destroyed despite devotion. Innocents suffer. The gods appear distant. Yet even here, explanation is restrained. The suffering is acknowledged, not resolved. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur, for instance, mourns devastation with vivid imagery. The city weeps. The temples fall silent. But the text does not explain why this catastrophe occurred beyond divine withdrawal. It does not question the structure itself. It accepts loss as part of the condition of existence. This acceptance suggests a civilization that has learned not to push certain questions too far. The cost of collapse is too high. Better to endure uncertainty than risk destabilization. The archaeological record supports this cautious mentality. After major collapses, rebuilding often occurs along familiar lines. Innovations are limited. The new city resembles the old. Memory is reconstructed through repetition rather than reimagining. Such repetition is not stagnation. It is survival strategy. In an environment prone to disruption, continuity reduces risk. The known is safer than the speculative. This strategy shapes how truth is handled. Truth is not an abstract ideal. It is contextual, bounded by what can be integrated without harm. The record preserves enough truth to function, not enough to destabilize. This perspective reframes the absence of beginnings yet again. The omission may reflect an ethical choice. Certain truths, even if once known, may have been judged too disruptive to preserve explicitly. Silence becomes a form of care. This possibility does not require conspiracy. It requires only institutional caution. Over generations, what is not copied disappears. What is copied survives. Selection becomes tradition. The scribes who chose which texts to preserve were not neutral archivists. They operated within institutional frameworks. Their priorities shaped the record. Administrative, ritual, and legal texts proliferated because they sustained order. Speculative texts faded because they did not. The result is a corpus heavy with function and light on origin. Civilization is presented as a given condition, not a question. The question of beginnings dissolves into irrelevance, yet traces of deeper memory remain. They surface indirectly, in metaphors of reduction, in myths of lost intimacy with the divine, in lists that begin mid-sequence. These traces suggest awareness without articulation. The Sumerians seem to have lived with a sense that something essential lay behind them, inaccessible but influential. This sense does not provoke reconstruction. It provokes reverence and restraint. In such a climate, civilization becomes an act of careful balance between remembering too much and forgetting too much. Both extremes are dangerous. Memory must be curated. This curation shapes identity. The Sumerians do not define themselves as founders. They define themselves as maintainers. Their pride lies in continuity, not novelty. Even their achievements are framed modestly. Great works are attributed to divine guidance. Success is borrowed, not owned. Failure is internalized as misalignment rather than blamed on circumstance. This posture produces a quiet resilience. Civilization does not shatter when explanations fail. It adapts through ritual, repetition, and controlled memory. Meaning is stabilized through practice rather than theory. The modern desire to extract origins from the Sumerian record often overlooks this cultural logic. What appears as absence may be presence operating differently. Silence carries weight. It performs work. The work of silence is to protect the system from unmanageable complexity. Origins are complex. They invite reinterpretation. They invite alternative possibilities. For a civilization oriented toward survival, such openness is risky. The Sumerians appear to have chosen closure over curiosity at the foundational level. This choice does not eliminate curiosity entirely. It channels it into safe domains: astronomy for calendrical alignment, mathematics for measurement, ritual for communication with the divine. Speculation about beginnings falls outside these domains. It offers no immediate benefit to maintenance. It risks destabilization. It is therefore left unspoken. Over time, this unspoken becomes unremembered. What begins as restraint becomes tradition. What is not recorded cannot be recovered. The result is a civilization whose earliest written voice speaks from within an already structured world, aware of loss but unwilling to narrate it. The beginning recedes not because it is unknown, but because it is unspeakable within the system that survives. This unspeakability gives the record its distinctive tone: calm, measured, restrained. Civilization is not justified, it is enacted. The tablets do not ask how order came to be, they show how order is kept. In doing so, they reveal a deeper truth, that for the Sumerians the greatest threat was not ignorance of origins, but failure of continuation. The silence around beginnings thus becomes an artifact of survival. It marks the boundary between what could be carried forward and what had to be left behind. The record remains, shaped by this choice, offering not a dawn, but a steady voice speaking from within. The long, careful labour of holding a world together after something essential has already slipped beyond recall. As the record continues to unfold without ever circling back to a true beginning, another dimension of the Sumerian silence becomes apparent: the way catastrophe is remembered without being anatomized. Destruction is acknowledged, even mourned, yet its deeper causes remain deliberately opaque. The civilization recognizes rupture, but resists dissection. The laments composed after the fall of major cities offer some of the most emotionally charged texts in the corpus. They describe temples emptied, gods departing, streets filled with silence, names erased from memory. The tone is intimate and devastating, and yet, even in grief, explanation remains restrained. The city falls because its destiny has shifted, because divine favour has withdrawn. The mechanism is not traced, the event is accepted. This pattern suggests a learned caution. To overanalyze catastrophe might imply that it could have been prevented through different choices, or that the cosmic order itself is flawed. Both implications threaten the stability of the worldview. Acceptance becomes safer than inquiry. In this context, the flood narratives take on renewed significance. They are among the few texts that gesture toward total rupture. The world is nearly erased. Memory is narrowed to a single survivor. Yet even here the flood is not explained in structural terms. Its causes are framed as imbalance, noise, excess. The solution is reduction, not reform. After the flood, civilization resumes with altered parameters. Lifespans shorten, authority tightens, mortality becomes fixed. The world continues but diminished. The flood does not inaugurate a new era of freedom. It imposes constraint. This motif of reduction reinforces the sense that civilization exists in the aftermath of something greater. The Sumerian worldview does not imagine progress toward perfection. It imagines survival after loss. Each iteration of order is thinner than the last. Archaeology mirrors this narrative in material form. Earlier phases show expansive settlements, experimentation, and diversity of form. Later phases show consolidation, standardization, and repetition. Variety gives way to uniformity. Flexibility yields to control. Such consolidation is often interpreted as maturation, but it can also be read as adaptation to trauma. After collapse, systems harden. Redundancy is reduced. Risk is minimized. Civilization becomes defensive. Defensive cultures tend to simplify memory. They retain what supports cohesion and discard what introduces ambiguity. Origins, with their inherent uncertainty, are prime candidates for omission. This does not mean the Sumerians were unaware of their own vulnerability. On the contrary, vulnerability saturates their literature. Humans are weak, cities are fragile, the gods are unpredictable, What is absent is not awareness, but speculation. Speculation appears dangerous in a world already strained by instability. The past contains wounds that cannot be reopened safely. Silence becomes a way of protecting the present. The cumulative effect of repeated catastrophe also shapes how continuity is imagined. Civilization does not appear as a single uninterrupted line. It appears as a series of recoveries. Each recovery builds on remnants. None claims to restore the whole. This recovery-oriented mindset explains why the earliest texts feel midstream. They speak from a position of rebuilding rather than founding. The tools of civilization are already in hand. The task is to use them carefully. Writing itself may have emerged as part of this recovery process. When oral continuity breaks, writing compensates. When memory fragments, tablets stabilize. The appearance of writing coincides not with exuberant creation, but with administrative necessity. Administrative necessity implies pressure. Pressure implies strain. Civilization writes because it must, not because it can. The first marks on clay are acts of urgency. Urgency does not invite origin stories. It demands function. Fields must be counted, offerings must be recorded, workers must be assigned. Survival depends on accuracy, not reflection. Over time, these urgent records accumulate into an archive that later readers mistake for a beginning. But the archive itself never claims to be one. It is a ledger of continuity, not a declaration of genesis. The absence of beginnings is therefore consistent with the emotional climate of the civilization. The Sumerians lived with the expectation of the loss. They prepared for it. They mourned it. They adapted to it. They did not romanticize the past as an Eden to be recovered. Even Dilmun, the distant land of purity, is not described as a lost home to be returned to. It is a conceptual elsewhere, a boundary marker between conditions. It reminds, but does not beckon. This restraint contrasts sharply with later traditions that frame history as a moral arc from creation to redemption. The Sumerian arc is flatter, heavier. It bends under its own weight. Redemption is not promised. Continuation is negotiated. Within such an arc, beginnings lose narrative centrality. What matters is the ability to absorb shock and persist. The civilization measures success not by how it started, but by how long it lasts. This perspective casts new light on the silence around origins. The silence may reflect not ignorance, but maturity. A civilization that has endured multiple disruptions learns where to place its attention. Origins do not feed the present. Practices do. This maturity does not eliminate longing. The texts occasionally gesture toward a time when boundaries were softer, when gods were closer, when life was longer. But these gestures are fleeting. They do not harden into narratives. The fleeting quality of these gestures suggests that whatever preceded the current order is not recoverable in narrative form. It belongs to a different mode of existence. Attempting to narrate it would distort it. Thus, the Sumerians choose to gesture rather than explain. They allow the sense of loss to remain diffuse. It informs behavior without demanding articulation. This choice shapes the emotional resonance of the record. It feels heavy, grounded, cautious. It carries the weight of experience without the clarity of explanation. Modern readers, accustomed to explanatory frameworks, often feel unsettled by this tone. They seek beginnings because beginnings promise clarity. The Sumerian record denies that promise. Instead, it offers something quieter. A civilization that has learned to live without full understanding of its own origins, focusing instead on the ethics of maintenance. The ethics of maintenance prioritize balance, restraint, and fidelity. They discourage speculation that could undermine cohesion. They elevate repetition over reinvention. In this ethical framework, silence is not emptiness. It is discipline. It holds the system together. The absence of a true beginning thus becomes one of the most revealing features of the Sumerian record. It signals a civilization shaped by rupture, oriented toward survival, and unwilling to trade stability for explanatory satisfaction. The record does not look backward in search of a lost dawn. It looks inward, attending to the fragile structures that remain. What it preserves is not a story of how civilization came to be, but a method for keeping civilization intact in a world where it has already nearly vanished more than once. The clay tablets, hardened by fire and time, carry this method forward. They speak not of beginnings, but of endurance. And in that endurance, the silence around origins becomes not a failure of memory, but a testament to what the civilization chose to protect, when memory itself could no longer hold everything. As endurance replaces explanation as the quiet priority of the Sumerian record, a deeper philosophical implication emerges. Civilization is treated less as an achievement, and more as a condition that must be continuously justified through behavior. Existence within order is not assumed to be deserved. It must be maintained through alignment, restraint, and correct action. This attitude reshapes the meaning of responsibility. Responsibility is not oriented toward the future in the sense of progress, but toward the present as a test of worthiness. Ritual accuracy, ethical conduct, and proper observance become measures of whether civilization may continue at all. Survival is conditional. Such conditionality permeates the literature. The gods grant favor, then withdraw it. Cities flourish, then fall silent. Kings reign, then are erased. Nothing is permanent. The system endures only insofar as it is continually reaffirmed. Civilization exists on probation. Within this framework, there is little incentive to celebrate origins. A beginning does not guarantee continuation. What matters is not how civilization began, but whether it continues to merit existence. The moral weight lies in maintenance. This moral dimension explains the persistent emphasis on humility. Human beings are repeatedly described as small, fleeting, and dependent. Their achievements are acknowledged but immediately relativized. Success invites vigilance rather than pride. Wisdom literature reinforces this stance. Texts reflect on the unpredictability of fortune, the fragility of happiness, the limits of knowledge. The wise person does not seek mastery. They seek balance. Excess ambition is portrayed as dangerous. Such teachings cultivate an inward focus. Civilization is not validated by expansion or conquest. It is validated by stability, fairness, and continuity. The measure of success is quiet persistence. This inward focus shapes the handling of history. Events are recorded but rarely interpreted. Chronology exists, but narrative arc is minimal. History is a ledger, not a drama. The absence of dramatic arc reinforces the sense that civilization is not moving toward a climax. It is circling within constraints. The future is not promised redemption. It promises repetition. In this context, beginnings lose narrative value. A beginning implies movement toward something. The Sumerian worldview does not support such teleology. It supports equilibrium. Equilibrium requires boundaries. Knowledge must stay within bounds. Power must stay within bounds. Memory must stay within bounds. Origins threaten boundaries by opening unregulated space for reinterpretation. The silence around beginnings thus functions as a boundary marker. It delineates the limits of permissible inquiry. Beyond this boundary lies speculation that cannot be integrated safely. This does not mean the Sumerians lacked curiosity. It means their curiosity was disciplined. It was directed toward domains where inquiry produced actionable alignment. Astronomy for calendars, mathematics for measurement, divination for decision-making. These inquiries do not seek to understand the world's origin. They seek to navigate the world as it is. They are practical sciences of survival. The focus on divination is particularly revealing. Omens are read not to predict innovation, but to avoid misalignment. Divination is a technology of caution. It seeks to minimize risk. This risk-averse orientation likely shaped what was remembered and what was allowed to fade. Origins, by their nature, invite radical reinterpretation. They destabilize inherited authority. Silence preserves hierarchy. Hierarchy, in turn, preserves order. Order preserves survival. The logic is circular but stable. Over generations, this logic hardens into tradition. The absence of origin narratives becomes normalized. It no longer requires justification. It simply exists as part of the inherited structure. Later cultures, encountering this silence, attempt to fill it. They construct genealogies, creation stories, linear histories. These efforts reflect different values and different experiences, but the earliest layer remains resistant. It speaks from within a world where the cost of collapse is still close to memory. In such a world, caution outweighs curiosity. The philosophical consequence is a civilization that defines itself not by where it came from, but by how it behaves. Identity is performative rather than narrative. One is Sumerian by acting correctly, not by tracing descent from a mythical beginning. This performative identity aligns with the emphasis on ritual. Ritual enacts belonging. It situates the participant within cosmic order regardless of origin. The past becomes less important than present alignment. Even lineage is treated carefully. Genealogies exist, but they are often abbreviated. What matters is current legitimacy, not ancient ancestry. Kings are validated by divine approval, not by distant forebears. This approach to legitimacy further diminishes the importance of beginnings. Authority flows through alignment, not origin. The source matters less than the correctness of transmission. Such a worldview produces a distinctive ethical atmosphere. There is seriousness, restraint, and attentiveness. Joy exists, but it is bounded. Excess is suspect. The absence of celebratory origin myths fits this atmosphere. Celebration belongs to moments of security. The Sumerian record speaks from within ongoing precarity. Precarity sharpens focus. It narrows acceptable discourse. It privileges what sustains life. Everything else becomes secondary. The modern impulse to recover beginnings reflects a different relationship to time and risk. It assumes that understanding origins strengthens identity. For the Sumerians, stability did not require explanation. It required discipline. This discipline shaped what was written and what was left unwritten. Over time, the unwritten receded beyond recovery. Silence became absolute. The resulting record feels incomplete to modern eyes, but coherent within its own logic. It offers continuity without genesis, order without narrative justification. In this coherence, the absence of beginnings becomes meaningful. It reveals a civilization that has chosen survival over self-explanation, endurance over origin. The clay tablets, in their repetitive, restrained voice, embody this choice. They do not tell us where civilization began. They show us how it was lived, day after day, under the shadow of loss. This shadow does not paralyze, it disciplines. It keeps attention focused on the fragile present. The legacy of this discipline is a record that resists our demand for beginnings, inviting instead a different kind of listening. A listening that accepts silence as part of meaning and recognizes that sometimes what is not said preserves more than what is spoken. In that listening, civilization appears not as a triumphal story, but as a careful practice carried forward without assurance, sustained by restraint and protected by the deliberate absence of a definitive beginning. As the long discipline of endurance continues to define the Sumerian record, another quiet pattern becomes unmistakable. Civilization is repeatedly framed as something that can be withdrawn. Order is not guaranteed, it is lent. The world persists only so long as permission is maintained. This idea appears subtly but consistently across hymns, prayers, and ritual texts. Cities are said to exist because the gods choose to dwell within them. When the gods depart, the city becomes hollow, even if its walls still stand. Civilization, then, is not anchored permanently to land or people. It is anchored to favor. Such a conception changes how permanence is understood. Stone and brick do not guarantee survival. Temples can be abandoned. Streets can fall silent. What matters is not material presence, but continued sanction from forces beyond human control. This belief shapes a culture deeply attentive to signs of withdrawal. Omens, portents, and divinatory practices occupy a central place. They are not tools of prediction in the modern sense. They are early warning systems designed to detect shifts in alignment before catastrophe becomes visible. The omnipresence of divination suggests a civilization living with the awareness that disaster rarely arrives without subtle precursors. A crack in ritual precision, a deviation in celestial pattern, an unexpected dream. These are read as tremors preceding collapse. Civilization survives by listening. Listening in this context is an ethical act. It requires humility and restraint. One must be willing to accept correction without full explanation. The gods do not argue, they signal. This signaling economy further explains the absence of origin narratives. Origins offer no actionable signals. They cannot warn. They cannot correct. They belong to a domain outside the operational logic of survival. Instead, the Sumerian focus remains on thresholds, moments when order might tip, boundaries where excess becomes dangerous. The record teaches how to recognize these boundaries and retreat from them. The flood myth again illustrates this logic. Humanity becomes too numerous, too noisy. The gods do not reform society, they reduce it. Afterward, new limits are imposed. The lesson is not moral improvement, it is recalibration. This emphasis on recalibration rather than transformation pervades Sumerian thought. When imbalance occurs, the solution is not invention, but subtraction. Noise is quieted, lifespans are shortened, authority is tightened. Such solutions imply a worldview that sees complexity as risk. Complexity must be managed carefully. Too much of it destabilizes the system. Civilization thrives not by expanding endlessly, but by pruning itself. This pruning logic carries ethical weight. Restraint becomes virtue. Excess becomes sin not because it is immoral, but because it threatens continuity. Ethics align with survival. Within such an ethic, beginnings lose importance. Beginnings are moments of expansion, of unregulated growth. They belong to a phase no longer accessible or safe. The present demands control. This demand shapes how memory is curated. Only what supports recalibration is preserved. What invites excess speculation is allowed to fade. Silence becomes functional. The gods themselves model this restraint. They are powerful but bounded. They do not create endlessly. They regulate. They enforce limits. Even divine authority is constrained by cosmic order. This mutual constraint reinforces the sense that the universe itself operates within inherited parameters. No one, human or divine, authors the system from scratch. Everyone participates in maintenance. This participatory maintenance extends to cosmology. The heavens are not chaotic. They move predictably. Their predictability allows humans to align calendars, rituals, and agriculture. Order is visible, but not explained. The lack of explanation is not ignorance, it is acceptance. The system works. Its origin does not need articulation to function. Civilization, in this light, resembles a long-standing mechanism whose builders are no longer present. The current inhabitants know how to operate it, repair parts of it, and recognize signs of malfunction. They do not know how it was built. Attempting to reconstruct its construction without sufficient knowledge risks damaging it. Better to operate it as received. This mechanical metaphor resonates with the bureaucratic tone of many Sumerian texts. The universe runs on procedures. Gods assign roles. Humans fulfill tasks. Disruption occurs when procedures are neglected. The emphasis on procedure over explanation again marginalizes origins. Procedures matter now. Origins belong to a time when the system was assembled, not when it is being maintained. This maintenance orientation shapes how the Sumerians imagine their own agency. Agency exists, but within limits. Humans can choose obedience or neglect, precision or carelessness. They cannot redefine the system. Such constrained agency fosters a particular psychological posture, attentiveness without illusion of control. One acts carefully, aware that consequences may exceed understanding. This posture is evident in the tone of prayers. Requests are humble, often tentative. Certainty is rare. One asks for continued favour, not entitlement. Entitlement would imply permanence. Permanence is not assumed. The world can be withdrawn. This awareness of withdrawability saturates the record with quiet tension. Every ritual, every inscription, every reconstruction carries the implicit hope that it will be enough to keep order in place. The absence of origin stories fits seamlessly into this emotional climate. Origins imply stability. They suggest a foundation that cannot be removed. The Sumerian worldview allows no such comfort. Even the land itself is unstable. Rivers shift, floods destroy. Fields salinize. Geography refuses permanence. Civilization adapts or moves. This environmental volatility reinforces the belief that nothing is fixed. Survival depends on responsiveness, not rootedness. Origins lose relevance in a landscape that constantly changes. Over time, this responsiveness becomes cultural reflex. Civilization learns to travel lightly in memory, carrying only what is necessary to function. The result is a record that feels strangely weightless in its treatment of beginnings, yet heavy in its attention to procedure. The weight is placed where it matters most. The modern desire to uncover beginnings often projects a different set of values onto the past. It assumes that knowledge of origin empowers the present. The Sumerian record suggests the opposite, that origin knowledge may be irrelevant or even destabilizing. For a civilization living close to collapse, empowerment lies in restraint, not revelation. This restraint does not diminish sophistication. On the contrary, it enables remarkable complexity within boundaries. Mathematics flourishes, astronomy advances, law develops, administration expands. These advances occur without reference to origin because they do not require it. They require accuracy, discipline, and continuity. Thus, the silence around beginnings is not a void. It is a boundary consciously maintained by a civilization attuned to its own fragility. What survives in the record is a way of living within limits, of sustaining order without illusion of permanence, of acting carefully in a world that can withdraw its support at any moment. The clay tablets carry this sensibility forward. They do not promise understanding, they offer practice. In this offering, civilization appears not as a story that begins, but as a condition that must be continually re-earned. The beginning recedes into irrelevance, not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer served the task at hand, keeping the world aligned, one careful act at a time, against the constant possibility of withdrawal. As the awareness of withdrawal settles into the background of every practice, another quiet transformation becomes visible in the Sumerian record, the gradual narrowing of human expectation. Civilization does not imagine itself moving toward fulfillment. It imagines itself learning to live with less. This narrowing is not sudden. It unfolds across myths, lists, and laments as a slow contraction of possibility. Early figures live longer. Later ones do not. Direct encounters with the divine fade into mediated rituals. Authority becomes increasingly procedural. Life becomes shorter, quieter, more regulated. What is remarkable is that this contraction is never framed as injustice. It is accepted as condition. The world, once wider, has become tighter. Civilization adapts rather than protests. This adaptation shapes how value is assigned. Grandeur gives way to reliability. Excess gives way to balance. Ambition yields to endurance. The highest good is no longer expansion, but stability. Such a shift profoundly alters how beginnings are perceived. Beginnings belong to a time of abundance, when possibilities were open and boundaries flexible. But abundance invites excess. Excess invites correction. The present exists after that correction. To dwell on beginnings would be to dwell on a mode of existence no longer compatible with survival. The Sumerian record looks away from that temptation. It keeps its gaze on what remains possible. This disciplined gaze is evident in the way heroes are portrayed. Gilgamesh, despite his strength and ambition, does not transcend human limits. His journey teaches restraint. He returns not with immortality, but with understanding of boundaries. Understanding replaces achievement as the central value. Wisdom is knowing where not to go. Civilization matures by learning what cannot be recovered. This maturity carries a subdued emotional tone. There is sorrow, but it is quiet. There is longing, but it is restrained. The record does not indulge nostalgia. It acknowledges loss without attempting to reverse it. The laments express grief for destroyed cities, but they do not promise restoration to former glory. They mourn what is gone and accept its absence. Reconstruction occurs, but on altered terms. This alteredness becomes normal. Civilization internalizes loss as part of its structure. Memory includes absence. Such internalization affects how future is imagined. The future is not a return to fullness. It is a continuation under constraint. The best outcome is preservation of order, not recovery of what was lost. This orientation toward diminished expectation explains the careful tone of Sumerian ethics. Advice literature emphasizes moderation, patience, and humility. Overreaching invites ruin. Acceptance invites survival. Within this ethical framework, the question of how civilization began becomes less compelling. Beginnings promise more than the present can sustain. They carry an energy that no longer fits. The record therefore centers on what can still be done. Fields can be measured, offerings can be made, rituals can be performed correctly. These acts sustain the narrowed world. Even the gods reflect this narrowing. Their interventions become less direct. Their presence is mediated through signs and institutions. They remain powerful, but distant. This distance reinforces the sense that something has closed. The age of intimacy has passed. Civilization continues without it. The Sumerians do not romanticize this closure. They work within it. Their texts convey acceptance rather than rebellion. This acceptance is not passive. It is active restraint. It requires constant effort to remain within bounds. Civilization becomes an exercise in discipline. Discipline over time becomes identity. One belongs by knowing how to behave, not by knowing where one comes from. Origins lose social function. The social fabric thus orients around practice rather than narrative. Shared rituals matter more than shared stories of beginning. Cohesion is enacted, not explained. This enactment produces a sense of continuity, even without origin. People know how to live together because they repeat inherited forms. Explanation becomes secondary. The record reflects this priority. It preserves instructions, not justifications. It tells how, not why. The modern discomfort with this absence of why reflects a different set of values. Modern societies often anchor identity in narrative origin. The Sumerians anchored it in sustained practice. This difference shapes the entire texture of the record. It feels grounded, procedural, inward-looking. It resists grand arcs. The more deeply one enters this texture, the clearer it becomes that the silence around beginnings is inseparable from the civilization's acceptance of diminished horizons. To speak of beginnings would be to reopen horizons that no longer exist. The Sumerian record does not attempt such reopening. It treats the narrowing of the world as irreversible. The task is not to expand again, but to survive well within constraint. This survival ethic carries a quiet dignity. It does not promise redemption. It does not demand explanation. It focuses on doing what remains possible with care. In this light, civilization appears not as a failed ascent, but as a successful adaptation. It persists despite knowing that it is not whole. The absence of origin stories becomes a mark of this adaptation. Civilization no longer needs them. They do not help maintain balance. They do not prevent collapse. What prevents collapse is attention, repetition, and restraint. The Sumerians perfected these arts. Their record bears witness to a long labour of holding together a world that has already lost something essential. This labour leaves little space for speculative beginnings. It demands focus on the present. The clay tablets speak from within this focus. They are steady, repetitive, unadorned. They carry the weight of acceptance. In that acceptance, civilization finds its voice, not loud, not triumphant, but enduring. The beginning recedes further into silence, not because it was insignificant, but because the present could not afford to dwell there. What remains is a civilization speaking from after the narrowing, after the contraction, committed to sustaining what still stands. This commitment, repeated across generations, becomes the true legacy, not the story of how civilization began, but the discipline through which it continued. And in that continuation, the silence around beginnings transforms from a mystery into a mirror, reflecting a culture that learned to live without answers it could no longer use. As the long arc of endurance approaches its final contours, the Sumerian record reveals a last quiet discipline, the cultivation of distance. Distance from origins, distance from certainty, distance even from hope. Civilization learns to stand slightly apart from its own desires, observing itself with restraint. This distance is not detachment in the modern sense. It is a practiced composure, developed over generations that learned how quickly closeness can become dependence, and how dependence can become collapse. The gods are revered yet kept at ritual distance. Power is honoured yet hedged with procedure. Knowledge is respected yet bounded by silence. Distance becomes a form of safety. This posture appears most clearly in the way Sumerian texts refuse to personalize cosmic processes. The universe is not dramatized as a story of intention. It is described as a system of relations. Events happen. Order shifts. Balance is restored or withdrawn. The narrative voice remains calm, almost impersonal, even when describing devastation. This impersonal tone is not indifference. It is composure under pressure. Emotion is present, but it is shaped, formalized, contained. Lamentation follows strict structures. Praise follows prescribed patterns. Spontaneity is rare. Spontaneity invites unpredictability. Unpredictability threatens order. Over time, this composure becomes internalized. Civilization no longer expects transparency from the world. It does not demand explanation. It accepts opacity as a condition of survival. This acceptance extends to the question of beginnings. The origin of civilization belongs to a domain too close, too volatile, too charged to be handled safely. Distance protects against destabilization. The Sumerians do not deny that something came before. They acknowledge it indirectly, through gestures of diminishment, through myths of reduction, through reverence for ancient order, but they keep that past at a respectful remove. Respectful distance allows continuity without obsession. It prevents the past from overwhelming the present. This is particularly evident in the treatment of ancestral figures. Early kings are named, their reigns recorded, but their inner lives remain opaque. They are symbols of continuity rather than personalities to be emulated. Their distance reinforces stability. The same applies to gods. They are powerful, yet strangely reserved. They do not narrate themselves. They are encountered through signs, rituals, and institutions. Their distance maintains their authority. In such a system, intimacy becomes risky. To know too much is to risk transgression. Distance preserves alignment. This alignment through distance logic shapes the Sumerian approach to meaning itself. Meaning is not extracted through interpretation. It is enacted through practice. One does not explain order. One performs it. Performance replaces narrative as the primary mode of engagement. Ritual does what stories cannot. It sustains alignment without requiring explanation. This reliance on performance reduces the need for origin narratives. Origins explain. Performance maintains. Maintenance is the priority. The record reflects this priority by privileging texts that instruct over texts that speculate. Lists endure longer than reflections. Procedures outlast philosophies. Where reflection appears, it is modest. Wisdom texts advise moderation, patience, acceptance. They do not offer cosmologies. They offer guidance for living within limits. Limits define the world. The Sumerians accept this with a clarity that feels almost austere. This austerity carries a subtle strength. It allows civilization to persist without illusion. There is no promise of return to fullness. There is no expectation of redemption. There is only the present task. The present task is to keep order intact for one more cycle. This cyclical orientation is crucial. Time loops back on itself through ritual and calendar. Festivals repeat. Year names recur. The rhythm stabilizes identity. In a looped time, beginnings lose their singularity. What matters is not the first instance, but the recurrence. Each repetition reaffirms existence. The absence of beginnings thus aligns with cyclical temporality. A cycle has no true start. It simply continues. The Sumerian world, governed by cycles of flood and drought, day and night, offering and withdrawal, finds coherence in repetition rather than origin. Repetition reduces anxiety. It creates predictability within uncertainty. Predictability is survival. This survival orientation reshapes the emotional register of civilization. Hope becomes quiet. Fear becomes disciplined. Joy becomes formal. The record speaks in a voice trained to endure. Modern readers sometimes interpret this voice as cold or distant. In context, it is protective. It shields the system from emotional extremes that could destabilize practice. The silence around beginnings is part of this shield. It prevents fixation on an irretrievable past. It keeps attention where it is needed. As the centuries pass, this silence becomes tradition. It no longer requires justification. It simply is. Later cultures inherit the forms without fully understanding the rationale. They may attempt to fill the silence with their own stories, but the earliest layer remains untouched. The earliest layer does not explain itself. It does not need to. It functions. Functionality becomes the measure of truth. What works endures. What does not fades. Origins, whatever they were, did not work for the present task. They were allowed to fade. This fading does not erase reverence. The past is honoured through preservation of form, not through reconstruction of story. The Sumerian record preserves order like a vessel preserves water, by shape, not by memory of how the vessel was made. The vessel does not narrate its creation, it holds. This holding is the quiet miracle of the civilization. It persists across collapses, language shifts, and cultural transformations. The cost of this persistence is silence. Certain questions remain unanswered. Certain memories remain inaccessible. The Sumerians accept this cost. They choose continuity over comprehension. This choice shapes the legacy they leave behind, a legacy not of beginnings, but of endurance. As the record approaches its end, this endurance feels neither triumphant nor tragic. It feels resolved. Civilization has learned what it can afford to remember. The beginning, whatever it was, lies beyond that affordability. What remains is a world held together by discipline, distance, and repetition. A world that does not explain itself, but continues. The clay tablets, aligned in archives and ruins, embody this posture. They do not reach backward in longing. They remain steady where they are. In their steadiness, they offer a final lesson. That sometimes the most enduring civilizations are those that learn not to ask for more than the present can sustain. The silence around beginnings becomes not a gap to be filled, but a space that allows the present to stand without collapse. And in that space, civilization breathes quietly, preserved not by knowing where it began, but by knowing how to remain. As the long thread of restraint, distance, and endurance draws toward its quiet close, the Sumerian record leaves behind not an answer, but a posture. It is the posture of a civilization that has learned to live without certainty about its own birth, and in doing so has learned something subtler about survival. What remains most striking after moving slowly through layers of silence is not what the Sumerians failed to say, but what they chose to sustain instead. They sustained rhythm. They sustained order. They sustained a way of being in the world that did not depend on origin myths for legitimacy. Civilization, in their view, does not stand on a remembered foundation. It stands on repetition, on calendars that return, on rituals that align, on measurements that remain consistent even as cities fall and rise again nearby. The ground beneath them shifts, but the pattern continues. This pattern is not heroic. It does not proclaim mastery. It accepts vulnerability as permanent. The Sumerian world is never safe. It is only held together for now. That awareness permeates the final emotional tone of the record. There is no crescendo, no revelation, no resolution. The voice remains even, deliberate, restrained. Civilization does not culminate. It persists. In this persistence, beginnings lose their power. A beginning promises direction. It implies purpose. The Sumerian worldview offers neither. It offers alignment without destination. To modern sensibilities, this may feel unsatisfying. We seek stories that explain where we came from so we can know where we are going. The Sumerian record suggests a different logic. Knowing where one came from does not guarantee knowing how to remain. Remaining is the harder task. The clay tablets speak from within this understanding. They do not narrate a dawn. They register a present held in place against forces that constantly threaten to dissolve it. Floods, droughts, forgetting, silence. Silence itself becomes meaningful here. It is not ignorance. It is compression. It is what remains after experience has narrowed what can be safely carried forward. The Sumerians carried forward what allowed them to live another season, another generation. They did not carry forward what invited destabilization. Origins belong to that second category. Over time, this choice reshaped memory itself. The past became a reservoir of form rather than story. What endured were structures, procedures, rhythms. What faded were explanations. This fading does not diminish the civilization. It clarifies its values. Survival over speculation, balance over revelation, practice over narrative. The absence of a true beginning thus becomes the most honest expression of their historical consciousness. They lived after something. They knew it. They adapted. Adaptation does not erase loss. It incorporates it. The Sumerian record is saturated with quiet grief, but it never allows grief to dominate. It becomes part of the texture of living. That texture is what endures across millennia, long after the cities themselves have crumbled. Not the story of how civilization began, but the manner in which it learned to continue without answers it could no longer afford. The record leaves us with an unsettling mirror. It asks us to consider whether our own fixation on origins is a form of comfort rather than necessity, whether explanation truly sustains civilization or whether discipline does. The Sumerians did not tell us where civilization began because they were occupied with something more urgent, keeping it alive. Their legacy is not a myth of creation, but a method of endurance, a way of holding order without illusion of permanence, a way of living with silence without filling it recklessly. In that silence there is neither promise nor despair. There is only continuation, measured and fragile. Civilization appears here not as a triumph over chaos, but as a narrow path walked carefully between forces that do not yield to understanding. A path maintained not by memory of a beginning, but by attention to the present step. The tablets end where they began, in the middle of things. Lists continue, names repeat, calendars turn, the voice does not rise to declare an ending, and perhaps that too is deliberate. For a civilization that never claimed a true beginning, an ending would carry too much symmetry, it would suggest closure. The Sumerian worldview allows no such certainty. What it allows is continuity until it cannot be maintained. The record, then, does not close a story. It leaves a posture behind, a posture of careful living in a world that has already shown how easily it can withdraw. In that posture, the absence of beginnings becomes a quiet instruction. Do not anchor identity in what cannot be recovered. Anchor it in what can still be done with care. Civilization survives, not by remembering its first moment, but by honouring the fragile present in which it finds itself, again and again. The clay tablets remain, pressed with signs that neither explain nor conclude. They endure as traces of a civilization that chose restraint over certainty, silence over speculation, and continuity over the comfort of a beginning. And in that choice, they leave behind not an answer, but a way of standing within time, attentive, measured, and unresolved.